Chapter 1. Before Florida was Florida. Long before Florida bore its name or found its place on a European map, it pulsed with life. Dense mangrove forests, sun-drenched estuaries, pine flatwoods, and deep cypress swamps were home not only to alligators, manatees, and panthers, but also to people. For thousands of years, humans walked this peninsula, adapted to its rhythms, and built entire civilizations that would rise, flourish, and vanish long before the sails of Spanish galleons ever appeared on the horizon. The first footprints in the Florida soil date back at least 14,000 years. Archaeological evidence, unearthed in places like the Page-Ladson site near the Osceola River, suggests that Paleo-Indians were already hunting mastodons and gathering freshwater plants during the last ice age. Back then, sea levels were far lower, and what we now call Florida was more than twice its current size. The coasts extended far into what is now the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic Ocean, and the climate was cooler, drier, and more hospitable for large game animals. As the Ice Age retreated and the seas crept inland, Florida began to take on the shape we recognize today. The ancient hunters adapted. They shifted their diets, learned to fish its brackish rivers and coastal shallows, and began to form semi-permanent settlements. Over the centuries, small bands became clans, and clans became societies. These people were not merely surviving. They were organizing, trading, and building. By the time European ships would one day arrive, Florida was a tapestry of complex indigenous cultures. Among the most prominent were the Timucua, Calusa, and Apalachee. Each group had carved out a domain in Florida's vast and varied geography, developing distinct identities, languages, and social systems shaped by their environment. To the north and northeast lived the Timucua, who occupied a broad territory stretching from what is now Jacksonville inland to the St. Johns River and parts of central Florida. They were not a single tribe, but rather a group of linguistically related chiefdoms that shared cultural features. Their world was one of broad rivers and fertile floodplains, where maize, squash, and beans grew beside villages of thatched huts. The Timucua were accomplished farmers, potters, and woodworkers. They hunted deer and wild turkey, fished the rivers, and even constructed dugout canoes from hollowed tree trunks using controlled fire and stone tools. Timucuan society was hierarchical. Chiefs, known as holatas, ruled over communities from wooden platform houses, supported by councils and priests. Religious life revolved around the natural world. Sun, moon, rain, and fire were sacred forces. Timucua warriors were formidable, their bodies often painted with black and red designs, and their hair elaborately styled into towering crests. They practiced ritual tattooing, often beginning in childhood, and adorned themselves with shells and feathers. Burial practices were rich in symbolism. Elites were interred with offerings, while sacred mounds marked the land with ancestral memory. Southwest of them, deep in the tangled coastal wetlands of the Gulf Coast, lived the Calusa. Where others farmed, the Calusa fished. Their kingdom rose not from fields, but from the water. They ruled the estuaries and mangrove islands of what is now the Fort Myers and Naples area, thriving in a world where river met sea. The Calusa are sometimes called the Shell Indians, and for good reason. They built entire islands, mounds, and platforms out of oyster shells, fish bones, and other marine debris. Their capital, near present-day Mound Key, was constructed almost entirely from such materials, evidence of generations of effort. Unlike most eastern woodlands peoples, the Calusa did not rely on agriculture. They harvested the sea with nets and weirs, using sharpened wooden spears to catch tarpon and mullet. They created elaborate canal systems, constructed ceremonial centers, and maintained a complex theocracy in which priests and nobles held tremendous power over commoners. Their rulers wore masks and regalia during ceremonies, and oral accounts suggest that some Calusa leaders governed more than 50 towns. Their influence extended as far as the Florida Keys, where they conducted trade and tribute missions in massive canoes capable of holding dozens of rowers. The Calusa were not only engineers and spiritualists, they were also warriors. They fiercely resisted outside intrusion and are among the few indigenous groups in North America known to have successfully repelled multiple Spanish expeditions for decades. Their hostility toward European newcomers would shape the tone of early colonial encounters in the region. To the northwest, where the land rises gently into rolling hills and pine-covered uplands, lived the Appalachee. Their territory centered on present-day Tallahassee and extended into southern Georgia. The Appalachee inhabited some of the richest soils in Florida, ideal for farming. They built powerful chiefdoms based on agriculture, especially the cultivation of maize. They lived in large villages surrounding temple mounds, where wooden buildings served as both religious and political centers. Appalachee society was stratified and sophisticated. They played a ceremonial ball game similar to the Mesoamerican games, fought ritual wars, and held communal festivals that marked the agricultural cycle. Their chiefs, adorned in copper and feathers, were seen as mediators between the earthly and spiritual realms. Archaeological sites such as Lake Jackson and Velda Mound reveal an impressive level of organization and regional influence. When Hernando de Soto's brutal expedition passed through their lands in 1539, he noted the strength and size of their towns and the fierceness with which they defended them. These three cultures, Timucua, Calusa, and Appalachee, did not exist in isolation. They traded across long distances, exchanged goods such as shell tools, copper, and pottery, and sometimes fought over borders and resources. They maintained mythologies, stories, and oral traditions passed down through generations, and each had adapted expertly to their corner of the Florida peninsula, mastering its challenges and harnessing its abundance. Their world, however, was on the cusp of change. Though they had never heard of Spain or of men with steel swords and horses, rumors would soon drift through trade networks. Tales of floating houses on the sea and pale-skinned invaders who brought thunder and fire. The arrival of Europeans would unleash plagues for which the indigenous peoples had no defense, followed by conquest, missionization, and rebellion. But in the centuries before that contact, Florida's native societies had crafted worlds of meaning, power, and beauty. The legacy of these early civilizations remains written in the landscape. Mounds rise from the forests like silent sentinels. Shell rings circle ancient campsites. Pottery fragments lie buried beneath neighborhoods and cattle pastures, and their names, though once nearly extinguished, are finding voice again. In schools, in museums, in the hands of archaeologists, and in the living descendants of other southeastern tribes. Before Florida was Florida, it was a homeland, a place of fire and water, belief and survival, shaped not by conquistadors or developers, but by the people who first called it home. Their story does not begin with conquest, but with resilience, and it is there that the true history of Florida begins. Chapter 2. The Spanish Arrive. The year was 1513, and the sea still held its secrets. Spanish ships moved cautiously through the shimmering waters of the Caribbean, their sails full of ambition and the scent of conquest. Among them was a vessel captained by Juan Ponce de Leon, a former governor of Puerto Rico, once a soldier under Christopher Columbus. He was not the first Spaniard to imagine new lands beyond the islands. but he would be the first to give a name to a place that would haunt Spain's imagination for centuries to come. La Florida. Ponce de Leon's motivations were tangled in rumor and ambition. Tales had circulated in the Caribbean of a land to the north, rich, green, and untamed. Some claimed it was an island. Others spoke of a miraculous spring whose waters could restore youth. Whether he believed in the fountain of youth or simply sought glory and land, Ponce de Leon set sail in March of 1513 with 3 ships and roughly 200 men. After passing through the Bahamas, he spotted land on April 2nd, just days after Easter Sunday, Pascua, Florida, in Spanish, the Feast of Flowers. The name stuck. He called the region La Florida. He landed somewhere near present-day St. Augustine, although the exact location is still debated. What is certain is that he did not find youth or gold, but a wilderness thick with pine, palmetto, and resistance. The land was inhabited, and its people were not welcoming. As the Spanish moved along the coast, they encountered the powerful Calusa, whose realm extended across the southern Gulf shores. From the start, it was clear the Calusa had no intention of submitting. They knew how to fight, how to strike from the water, and how to vanish into the mangroves. The Spaniards, unfamiliar with the tides and terrain, struggled to assert control. Skirmishes broke out. Arrows flew from canoes. Spanish crossbows answered. The Calusa were not impressed by the Spanish armor or weapons. They had seen other foreigners before, shipwrecked sailors or occasional traders, but these newcomers came with flags, not friendship. At one point, Ponce attempted to take captives. It was a critical mistake. He underestimated the strength and organization of the native societies, and by the time his expedition turned back toward Cuba, his men had faced enough bloodshed to reconsider the peninsula's promise. Ponce de Leon had charted the coast, but he had not conquered anything. Still, Spain now considered Florida part of its domain, written into royal maps and imperial ambitions. Despite the resistance, Spain was not deterred. In the following decades, more expeditions followed, driven by the logic of empire. Some came searching for gold, others for souls to convert. None found what they sought. Florida became a place where ambition met disaster. The next serious attempt came in 1521, when Ponce de Leon returned with the intent to colonize. This time, he brought settlers, livestock, and dreams of a permanent foothold. But the Calusa had not forgotten. Before the colony could take root, they struck. Ponce was wounded in the thigh by a poisoned arrow and was carried back to Cuba, where he died shortly after. Florida, it seemed, had a will of its own. Throughout the 1520s and 1530s, Spain sent several expeditions into the region. None succeeded. The coastline was difficult to navigate, the interior dense and confusing, the indigenous peoples fiercely territorial. The Spanish brought steel and gunpowder, but they also brought diseases, unknowingly unleashing a silent invasion. With every landing, they left behind microbes that would eventually devastate native populations, often before a single shot was fired. In 1528, a new chapter of Florida's conquest unfolded when Pánfilo de Narváez led a doomed expedition along the Gulf Coast. He brought hundreds of men and marched inland, only to face starvation, hurricanes, and unrelenting indigenous attacks. Narváez vanished somewhere along the coast, lost in storm and desperation. Only 4 survivors would live to tell the tale years later. Among them, Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, whose account paints a picture of chaos, hunger, and the harsh reality of Florida's terrain. Still, Spain pushed forward. Florida was no longer just a dream. It had become a challenge to the Spanish crown's authority and pride. The land was viewed not only as territory to be claimed, but as a gate to the greater riches of the continent. Rumors swirled that the mythical cities of gold, like Cibola and El Dorado, might be hidden further inland, just beyond Florida's swamps and forests. Yet each effort to tame the region brought more resistance. The indigenous tribes, especially the Calusa in the south, the Apalachee in the northwest, and the Timucua in the northeast, were not passive witnesses to their own fate. They fought back. They ambushed. They adapted to Spanish tactics and used the land to their advantage. The Spanish, despite their military technology, found themselves at a disadvantage in this hostile and unfamiliar world. Even as early missionaries attempted to make contact and offer Christianity in exchange for peace, many native communities viewed them with deep suspicion. While some tribes tolerated or even allied with the Spaniards briefly, most engagements ended in blood. The Spanish, accustomed to dealing with fragmented resistance in the Caribbean, found Florida to be a web of independent and well-organized chiefdoms, each fiercely defending its own land and people. By the 1540s, Florida had gained a reputation among Spaniards as a place of death and failure. Expeditions arrived, broke apart, or were swallowed by jungle and sea. No gold was found, no great cities emerged. And yet, Spain would not give up. Part of this persistence was strategic. Florida sat atop crucial maritime routes. The Gulf Stream, which curved around the peninsula, was a vital corridor for Spanish treasure fleets returning from Mexico and the Caribbean to Europe. Any power that controlled Florida could, in theory, disrupt this flow of silver and goods. Spain feared the French or English might try to establish footholds there if it did not. But the cost of control was high. The physical landscape defied Spanish models of colonization. There were no vast empires like the Aztecs or Inca to conquer and absorb, no centralized systems to co-opt. Florida was fragmented, wild, and deeply resistant to European intrusion. And yet, it was now a name inked on maps, spoken in Spanish courts, and etched into the dying words of soldiers and priests. Its story had begun to merge with that of Europe, though the peninsula itself remained largely unconquered. The Spaniards had arrived. They had claimed. They had bled. But Florida was not theirs. Not yet. As the 16th century advanced, Spain would continue to probe its shores, send settlers, and fight skirmishes with the native inhabitants. Forts would rise. Missions would be built. But these efforts belonged to a future chapter. For now, Florida stood untamed, a land of wind and heat, of arrow and cross, of hope and defeat. The conquest had begun, but it would be a slow-burning struggle, defined more by resistance than submission. Juan Ponce de Leon had dreamed of a land of flowers, a paradise. What he found instead was a place where nature was fierce and the people fiercer still, and though his bones would rest in Puerto Rico, the name he gave would endure. Florida was no longer a whisper on the wind. It was now part of the story of empire, war, and survival. Chapter 3: A Battleground of Empires. Florida never chose its fate. It was not gold or silver that made it valuable, but geography, its position like a dagger jutting into the sea, flanked by the Gulf and the Atlantic, watching over the sea lanes that linked empire to empire. As the ambitions of Europe grew restless in the 16th and 17th centuries, Florida became something more than wild forests and scattered native villages. It became a symbol, a strategic foothold, and a pawn in a game far bigger than itself. Spain had claimed Florida first. But claiming was not the same as holding. Its earliest colonies had failed or been burned to the ground. Yet Spain refused to abandon the peninsula. In 1565, they made their most enduring mark by founding Saint Augustine, led by Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. It was no paradise, but it was fortified, defensible, and most importantly, it was a statement. Spain would not yield this land. Not long before that, in 1564, French Protestants, Huguenots, had tried their luck along the St. Lawrence River. John's River, building Fort Caroline and dreaming of a haven far from the Catholic violence of their homeland. They were idealists, and their presence was more than just a colonial experiment. It was an insult to Spain. When word reached Menéndez that French heretics had taken root in La Florida, his mission became one not only of colonization, but of holy war. The result was swift and brutal. Menéndez and his soldiers descended upon Fort Caroline, slaughtered nearly everyone, sparing only women, children, and a few Catholics. Days later, shipwrecked French survivors were found and executed. It was not called a massacre at the time. It was, in Spanish eyes, divine justice. But it left a bitter taste in the mouths of France's royal court, and further cemented Florida's role not as a fertile colony, but a battleground of pride and power. Over the next century, Spain's grip on Florida tightened, but it remained fragile. St. Augustine was expanded. Missions stretched northward into Appalachia and Timucua territories, and soldiers manned wooden forts. But the colony never boomed. It never grew rich. The gold Spain had once dreamed of was always somewhere else, in Mexico, in Peru, in the Andes. Florida was a shield for those routes, not a treasure in itself. That shield, however, had cracks. England was rising as a global rival, and its ambitions along the Atlantic coast brought it ever closer to Spanish lands. By the late 1600s, English traders and settlers from Carolina began creeping south, making alliances with native groups hostile to Spanish rule. They traded muskets, rum, and cloth in exchange for deerskins and slaves, an exchange that changed the power dynamics of the entire region. For the indigenous peoples of Florida, these imperial rivalries were more than distant politics. They meant war. Tribes such as the Creek, Yamasee, and others, emboldened by English guns, launched raids into Spanish mission territory. Villages burned, churches crumbled. The mission system, once Spain's great civilizing project, began to unravel. Appalachia Province, once thick with Franciscan missions and native towns, fell into chaos. Thousands were killed or enslaved. Survivors fled to St. Augustine or further south, seeking protection the Spanish could no longer offer. The English pushed harder. In 1702, during Queen Anne's War, the North American theater of the War of the Spanish Succession, English forces from Carolina, aided by native allies, attacked St. Augustine. The city was burned outside the walls of the Castillo de San Marcos, though the fort held firm. It was a symbolic moment. Florida could no longer defend itself unaided. The empire it protected seemed far away, distracted, disinterested. Yet Spain remained, stubbornly, year after year, even as their empire began to waver elsewhere. They rebuilt burned missions, reinforced the fort, and tried to rekindle their influence. But the 18th century would not be kind to Spanish Florida. Britain's colonies to the north were swelling in number and wealth, their cities expanding, their ships dominating the coastlines. Spain's Florida, by contrast, remained poor, underpopulated, and under siege. In 1763, after yet another war, this time the 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in the Americas, the European chessboard was rearranged. Spain, having sided with France and lost, was forced to cede Florida to the British in exchange for the return of Havana, which Britain had seized during the war. It was a quiet surrender of a land long fought over, but no longer worth the cost of defending. Spain walked away. Britain stepped in. For the British, Florida was a new opportunity. They divided the region into two colonies, East Florida, centered around St. Augustine, and West Florida, with Pensacola as its capital. The division was practical. The two halves were separated by vast stretches of sparsely inhabited land, and their trade routes pointed in different directions. British Florida was meant to be a profitable, functioning part of the empire, not a backwater. To encourage settlement, Britain offered generous land grants. Loyalists fleeing the unrest in the 13 colonies to the north found new homes in East Florida. Plantations began to appear, cultivating indigo, rice, and citrus. Roads were built, ports expanded. The British governed with a lighter touch than the Spanish had, and their rule was, for a brief time, relatively stable. But that stability was not to last. As rebellion brewed in the northern colonies and the American Revolution exploded, Florida again found itself a pawn in an empire's retreat. Unlike Georgia or South Carolina, East Florida remained loyal to the crown. It became a haven for British loyalists and a staging ground for military operations against the rebelling colonies. Yet when the war ended in 1783, Britain was forced to make hard choices. To regain access to lucrative Caribbean islands, the British agreed to return Florida to Spain. So Spain returned, 20 years older, a little more weary, and faced with a Florida now changed. The Spanish crown found a colony filled with English-speaking settlers, British legal structures, and Protestant churches. Many loyalists packed their belongings and left, heading for the Bahamas or Canada. Others remained, negotiating with the returning Spanish administration. The result was a cultural patchwork. Spanish law, British architecture, African slavery, and native displacement, all colliding in a strange, unstable borderland. By the late 18th century, Spain was no longer the unchallenged master of the New World. The American Republic to the north was growing rapidly, and its expansionist vision pointed south. Florida, weakly held and lightly populated, once again looked vulnerable. The Seminoles, an emerging indigenous group made up of displaced Creeks, runaway slaves, and others, began to assert themselves in northern Florida, complicating Spain's control even further. The land that had once been seen as a paradise by some, a religious battleground by others, and a strategic linchpin by many, had now become something else. A relic of empire, passed from crown to crown, each time with promises of renewal, each time leaving behind layers of displacement, resistance, and ambition. In just over 2 centuries, Florida had changed hands more times than most colonies in the New World. It had witnessed religious war, imperial rivalry, the destruction of native worlds, and the struggle of empires to bend it to their will. And still, it had not settled. Still, it stood at the edge of what was coming. The Spanish were back, for now, but the world around them was changing fast. Chapter 4. The Seminole Wars. The earth trembled beneath boots and hooves. Florida, once the edge of empire, now stood at the heart of a storm neither Spain nor Britain could control. When Spain handed the peninsula over to the United States in 1821, it did so quietly, with a treaty inked in distant capitals. But the land itself would not pass so easily. There were people still here who would not sign away their birthright. The Seminoles had not been conquered by the British. They had not been pacified by the Spanish. and they had no intention of yielding to a young republic whose hunger for land had only begun. The Seminole were not born from a single origin. They were a people forged from flight. In the late 1700s, as pressure mounted on the Creek Confederacy to the north, bands of Miccosukee, Creek, and other groups drifted southward into the unclaimed wilds of northern and central Florida. They were joined by escaped African slaves, free black families, and other displaced indigenous peoples. What emerged was not a traditional tribe in the old sense, but something new. A confederation of resistance, bound together more by necessity than blood. They called themselves the Seminole, likely from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning runaway or wild one. At first, the newcomers had no masters. Florida was Spanish on paper, but Spanish authority barely reached beyond St. Augustine and Pensacola. The Seminole carved out a life in the swamps and pine barrens, raising livestock, growing corn and squash, and establishing settlements stretching from the Suwannee River to the Everglades. They had no central capital, no single chief, but rather a network of towns and leaders. Their society was matrilineal, their warriors agile and experienced in guerrilla tactics. They knew the land. They knew how to vanish, and they had no reason to trust the promises of governments. Then came the United States, and with it, settlers, hungry for land, uneasy about black freedom, and suspicious of any people who resisted the boundaries of race, property, and power. To these settlers, the Seminole were more than an indigenous group. They were an obstacle. Worse still, they were a sanctuary. Runaway slaves found shelter in Seminole towns. Intermarriage was common. The lines between black and indigenous blurred. To Southern slaveholders, Florida was becoming something dangerous, a refuge. Tensions boiled quickly. In 1817, even before Florida was formally transferred, U.S. forces under General Andrew Jackson marched south into Spanish territory, citing attacks on settlers and the harboring of fugitives. What followed was a violent campaign. Villages burned, crops destroyed, leaders hanged. Jackson even seized Spanish forts at St. Mark's and Pensacola, daring Spain to protest. They did not. The Seminole, however, remembered. The First Seminole War, though never officially declared, marked the beginning of a long and bitter conflict. It was a preview of things to come, of the clash between a rising American empire and a people who refused to be removed, relocated, or rewritten. Florida changed flags again in 1821. This time, it was the American Star-Spangled Banner that flew. But in the forests and glades, the Seminole remained. In the years that followed, pressure intensified. As cotton agriculture expanded and the Indian Removal Act passed in 1830, the fate of the southeastern tribes was sealed in policy. Removal was no longer a threat. It was a federal mandate. Treaties were drafted, often in bad faith or with signatures from leaders who lacked true authority. One such agreement, the Treaty of Payne's Landing in 1832, claimed the Seminole had agreed to relocate to lands west of the Mississippi. Many chiefs denied this. Others refused outright. Among the most vocal opponents was a young leader named Osceola. Born of mixed Creek and possibly Scottish or English ancestry, Osceola had grown up among the Seminole and identified fully with their cause. He was charismatic, proud, and uncompromising. When U.S. officials tried to enforce the removal treaty, Osceola led the resistance, not from a palace or capital, but from the shadows of the forests, from hammocks hidden deep in the swamp. In 1835, war exploded again. It began with blood. On a December morning near present-day Bushnell, a column of over 100 U.S. soldiers under Major Francis Dade marched south through Seminole territory, unaware that they were being watched. At a precise moment, warriors opened fire. Only a handful of soldiers survived. The Dade Massacre, as it came to be known, electrified the nation and shocked military planners. The Seminole had declared their answer to removal. What followed was the Second Seminole War, longer, costlier, and more brutal than the first. It would last 7 years, from 1835 to 1842, making it the longest and most expensive Indian War in U.S. history. Tens of thousands of U.S. troops were deployed, supported by naval patrols, militia units, and scouts. But the Seminole refused to meet them in open battle. They struck at night, melted into the swamps, and turned the terrain into a weapon. They had no cities to burn, no fortresses to siege, no roads to guard. Their homeland was a maze of water and foliage, and they knew every trail. Osceola became a legend. He attacked supply lines, punished collaborators, and outmaneuvered larger forces. His resistance was not without cost. Villages were destroyed, families displaced, but he embodied the Seminole spirit of defiance. His capture in 1837, under a flag of truce, was seen by many as a betrayal. He was taken to Fort Marion in St. Augustine and later died in captivity, his face etched in sorrow and rage. His death did not end the war. By the early 1840s, the U.S. military had adopted scorched earth tactics, destroying crops, poisoning water supplies, and capturing women and children to force surrenders. Most of the Seminole were eventually rounded up and sent west to Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma. Thousands died in transit or succumbed to disease and despair. But not all were taken. In the deepest parts of the Everglades, a small number of Seminole families refused to leave. They dug in, they went silent, and they survived. There was no peace treaty. The war simply stopped. U.S. forces withdrew. The cost had grown too high, the returns too uncertain. In Washington, officials called it a success, but the Seminoles still lived in Florida, scarred, hunted, but unconquered. In 1855, hostilities flared again. The Third Seminole War, shorter and smaller than the last, broke out after the U.S. Army began surveying southern Florida for potential settlements. When soldiers uprooted Seminole crops and desecrated graves, warriors retaliated. Fighting resumed in pockets of the Everglades, but the resistance had changed. This was not the fiery defiance of Osceola's day. It was a grim endurance. By 1858, the war was declared over, and the U.S. government again claimed victory. But once more, not all Seminole had been removed. A few hundred remained, hidden deep in the wilderness. They lived off the land, avoided roads and towns, and built a culture of secrecy and survival. They kept their language, their ceremonies, their history. Their existence was not a relic of the past. It was a living defiance of it. The Seminole Wars did not reshape the entire nation, but they left deep marks in Florida. They changed the land itself. Missions abandoned, settlements abandoned, populations shifted, and they exposed a truth that many in power did not wish to see, that removal was not always complete, that resistance could outlast conquest, that some people, no matter the odds, would not be moved. Chapter 5. Joining the Union. The swamps had quieted for a time. The Seminole Wars had drained the treasury, scarred the land, and silenced much of the resistance. Yet even as the gunfire faded into memory, another kind of conquest was taking place. one not carried out by soldiers, but by planters, surveyors, politicians, and slaves. Florida was changing. Its soil was being claimed, platted, and planted. Its future was being written in cotton and sugar, ink and chains. In 1821, the United States formally took possession of Florida from Spain. The transition, like so many things in imperial history, occurred more in treaties than in reality. For the people on the ground, Seminole families, black homesteaders, Spanish-speaking settlers, and recent American arrivals, little changed overnight. But in Washington and Tallahassee, a new map had taken shape, and Florida was now part of the American story. The federal government organized the region as a territory, not yet a full state. Andrew Jackson, already infamous among the Seminole, became its first military governor. He arrived with a swagger and a pen, ready to extend American law and wipe away the last traces of Spanish colonial order. New counties were drawn, roads surveyed, and American settlers began to arrive, first in trickles, then in waves. The early years of territorial Florida were rough and improvisational. Much of the land was still untamed, and lawlessness reigned in many parts. Settlers clashed with indigenous bands and sometimes with each other. Militias doubled as local police. The economy was fragile, dependent on barter, speculation, and subsistence farming. But beneath this surface disorder, something more permanent was taking shape. A plantation society modeled on those in Georgia and South Carolina. The soil of northern Florida, particularly in the red hills around Tallahassee and the fertile banks of the Suwannee and Apalachicola rivers, proved ideal for cotton. Sugarcane thrived further south, and with these crops came the institution that would define the territory's political and economic identity: slavery. Wealthy planters moved in from the older states, bringing enslaved people with them, or purchasing them upon arrival. By the 1830s, enslaved laborers outnumbered white settlers in some regions. Plantation houses rose among the pines, white columns looking out over fields plowed by hands in chains. Enslaved people cleared the land, built the infrastructure, harvested the cotton, and suffered in silence, or fled when they could. Some found refuge among the Seminole. Others tried to reach Spanish-speaking communities in Cuba or Mexico. Most remained trapped in the brutal rhythm of Southern agriculture. Their lives were the unspoken foundation of Florida's growing wealth. The territorial government, dominated by planters and slaveholders, worked to solidify this social order. Laws were passed restricting the movement of free black people. Patrols were established to prevent uprisings. Public discourse in the press and politics emphasized Florida's natural place within the Southern system, not only geographically, but culturally and economically. The land, they argued, demanded cotton, and cotton demanded slavery. Meanwhile, the dream of statehood gathered momentum. Becoming a state meant more than symbolic legitimacy. It meant political power. It meant seats in Congress, control over internal development, and the ability to shape laws without waiting for federal approval. But it also meant choosing sides in the growing sectional divide between North and South. That divide was no longer just philosophical. It was rapidly becoming political, driven by debates over whether new states would allow slavery or not. Each new application for statehood was treated like a battlefield. Would it tip the balance in the Senate toward the free states or the slaveholding ones? Florida's candidacy was thus not just a local issue, it was a national controversy. By the 1840s, the push became more strategic. Iowa, a free territory in the north, was also preparing for statehood. Southern lawmakers, worried about the balance of power, saw Florida as a necessary counterweight. The political bargain was clear. Florida and Iowa would enter the Union together, one slave, one free. In this delicate arithmetic, human bondage was reduced to a legislative calculation. Still, Florida had to prove it was ready. It needed a constitution, infrastructure, and the population to justify statehood. In 1838, delegates gathered at St. Joseph to draft Florida's first state constitution. The resulting document was a clear reflection of its authors. It enshrined slavery, restricted voting rights to white male property holders, and closely mirrored the constitutions of other Deep South states. The road to admission was not smooth. Debates dragged on, and events outside Florida sometimes stalled the process. But finally, in March 1845, Florida was admitted to the Union as the 27th state. It was a moment of triumph for the planters and politicians who had pushed for it. A declaration that Florida had been remade in the image of the Old South. The capital, Tallahassee, stood as a symbol of this new identity. A southern town on a hill, surrounded by plantations and connected by dusty roads to the growing port cities along the Gulf. Apalachicola shipped bales of cotton abroad. Pensacola continued its role as a military and commercial hub. And Key West, though distant and eccentric, played its part as a trading post between empires. Statehood brought new challenges. The promise of economic expansion brought in new settlers, many poor and landless, hoping to claim parcels of land and start anew. For some, it worked. For others, the best land was already spoken for by wealthy interests. The divide between rich and poor widened. Political life was dominated by a small elite, and local government often served the planter class first and foremost. Meanwhile, slavery continued to shape every aspect of life. Enslaved men, women, and children built the roads, staffed the homes, picked the cotton, and drove the economy forward. Resistance remained. Quiet acts of defiance, work slowdowns, secret meetings, and songs filled with double meanings. Every plantation was a site of surveillance and fear. Every field whispered of pain. Yet in the eyes of the dominant political class, Florida was thriving. Its status as a slave state was secure. Its exports were growing. Its railroads were under construction. And its position in the Union, though precarious, gave it a voice in national politics. But under the surface, tensions smoldered. Statehood had been achieved, but the contradictions at its core remained unresolved. Freedom and bondage lived side by side. Ambition and brutality walked the same roads. Florida had joined the Union, but not at peace. Chapter 6: Civil War and Reconstruction. The decision came swiftly, though not without division. In January 1861, Florida declared its secession from the United States, the third state to do so after South Carolina and Mississippi. The ink was barely dry on the statehood document signed 16 years earlier. Now, the same legislature that had once celebrated entry into the Union turned its back on Washington and threw its lot in with the Confederacy. The cause was not cloaked in mystery. It was spelled out plainly in speeches, editorials, and legislative resolutions. The defense of slavery, the protection of property, and the preservation of a Southern way of life. Florida was young, but not naive. It knew the cost of this gamble. It had few people, barely 140,000 in total, nearly half of them enslaved. It had little industry, no major rail hubs, no sprawling cities, but it had land, coastline, and a fierce commitment to the Confederate cause. Its contribution would not come in the form of grand battles or mass mobilization, but through ports, cattle, and the steady hum of a wartime economy feeding the rebellion. The first shot in Florida came not in a plantation field, but in a fort. Federal troops, still garrisoned at Fort Pickens near Pensacola, refused to abandon their post even after the state seceded. Confederate forces quickly occupied nearby Fort Barrancas and the Pensacola Navy Yard, setting up a tense standoff across the bay. It would remain one of the longest-held Union strongholds in the South. Fort Pickens never fell. Florida's geography shaped its war. It was long and narrow, wrapped in marsh and sea, with few good roads and a coastline that stretched endlessly. Its vast pine forests and swamps provided excellent cover for guerrilla activity, but poor terrain for large military campaigns. As a result, Florida became more a supplier than a battlefield. Thousands of head of cattle were driven north to feed Confederate armies. Salt works churned along the Gulf to preserve meat. Blockade runners darted through Union naval patrols, slipping out of ports like Tampa and Cedar Key under the cover of darkness. The war was fought quietly in Florida, less in cannon blasts and more in smuggled goods, seized ships, and whispered news. Still, battles came. In October 1862, Confederate forces clashed with Union troops at the Battle of St. John's Bluff, near Jacksonville. The Confederates were forced to abandon their fortifications, and Union forces temporarily took control of the region. Jacksonville would change hands multiple times throughout the war, a symbol of Florida's instability and the limits of both sides' power in the region. But it was in 1864 that Florida witnessed its largest and most consequential battle. Union General Truman Seymour, hoping to disrupt Confederate supply lines and encourage Unionist sentiment, led an expedition inland from Jacksonville. His goal was to seize Tallahassee, cut off railway lines, and perhaps even draw black recruits to the Union cause. He was met by a Confederate force of around 5,000 men under General Joseph Finnegan near the small town of Olustee, west of Lake City. The Battle of Olustee was a brutal and decisive Confederate victory. Union forces were driven back with heavy casualties, more than 1,800 dead, wounded, or missing. The defeat halted any serious Union attempt to occupy the interior of the state. Tallahassee, alone among Southern capitals east of the Mississippi, would remain in Confederate hands until the war's end. The war deepened existing divides and created new ones. Enslaved people seized moments of chaos to flee, sabotage, or resist. Union gunboats offered escape to those who could reach the coast. In remote parts of northern Florida, resentment toward wealthy planters bubbled over. Some poor white farmers, conscripted to fight for a cause that offered them little, deserted or refused to enlist. Bands of Union sympathizers hid in the swamps, raided Confederate supply lines, and passed information to the enemy. Florida was officially Confederate, but not every Floridian was loyal to the Confederacy. By 1865, the war was unwinding. News traveled slowly, and in the scattered communities of Florida, rumors often arrived before facts. In April, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and the Confederate government collapsed. The Southern cause was lost. In May, Union troops entered Tallahassee without resistance. The war was over, but peace did not mean order. Reconstruction came not as a healing process, but as a second battle, this time over the meaning of freedom, the structure of society, and the limits of power. The immediate priority of the occupying Union forces was to restore civil government and begin integrating the state back into the Union. For formerly enslaved people, the moment was electric and terrifying. Freedom was real but fragile. The promise of land, education, and political participation was whispered in churches, argued in town halls, and sabotaged in the shadows. The federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau to help manage the transition from slavery to freedom. Schools were opened, contracts were drawn up between former masters and freedmen, now nominally employees. But the system was flawed from the start. Planters resented the Bureau's interference and often ignored its rulings. Freed people, lacking land or leverage, were often forced back into exploitative labor arrangements that mimicked the old order. The shackles were gone, but the chains remained in wages, law, and violence. Politically, Reconstruction in Florida was turbulent. A new constitution was required, one that recognized the end of slavery and aligned with federal demands. Under military supervision, elections were held. For the first time, Black men voted and held office. Their presence in state politics was real and transformative, though never uncontested. Opposition was swift and often brutal. White supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using terror and intimidation to reclaim power by any means necessary. The economy, shattered by war and transition, struggled to recover. Plantations were broken up or abandoned. Cotton prices collapsed. Formerly enslaved workers had few resources and little access to land. Railroads and port infrastructure, vital to rebuilding commerce, were slow to recover. Many towns shrank. Some vanished altogether. Others tried to reinvent themselves in the face of uncertainty. Tensions simmered across every line: race, class, politics, and memory. Some white Floridians clung to the mythology of the lost cause, recasting the war as a noble fight for liberty rather than a defense of slavery. They resented Northern troops, carpetbaggers, and the new multiracial political order. Others, including newly freed communities, looked to the future with cautious hope, trying to build churches, schools, and businesses under constant threat of retaliation. By the late 1860s, the federal grip on Florida, as with much of the South, began to loosen. The war had been fought to preserve the Union, not necessarily to remake the South. As Northern priorities shifted and political fatigue set in, Reconstruction policies were rolled back. Florida was readmitted to the Union in 1868 under a new constitution that technically guaranteed civil rights, but enforcement was often hollow. The land remained divided, not just in ownership, but in memory. The scars of the war were not only physical, but moral. For decades, the state would live with those scars, burying them under monuments, political campaigns, and selective histories. But the truth remained, etched in the fields where enslaved people once labored, in the pine barrens where deserters hid, and in the fading cemeteries where Union and Confederate dead lay side by side. Florida had gone to war for slavery. It had lost. And it had emerged, changed, but not transformed. Chapter 7: Railroads, Real Estate, and Hurricanes. The train changed everything. Before steel rails sliced through the palmetto and pine, Florida remained a distant, tangled edge of America, charming, warm, wild, but largely inaccessible. It was a place of riverboats and rutted dirt paths, of cattle drives and steamboats that navigated slow, shallow waterways. Then came the railroad. Then came Henry Flagler. Flagler was not born a Floridian. He arrived with northern wealth, the kind made not from oranges or cotton, but from kerosene and pipelines. As a co-founder of Standard Oil, he had already built one empire. What he found in Florida was an opportunity to build another, this time not in oil, but in infrastructure, hotels, and land. When his wife's health brought him south in the 1880s, Flagler saw more than sunshine. He saw a state waiting to be reinvented. He began in St. Augustine, restoring the crumbling colonial town into a resort for the northern elite. He constructed the Ponce de Leon Hotel in 1888, a marvel of poured concrete, Tiffany glass, and Moorish towers. But a hotel, however grand, needed visitors, and visitors needed railroads. So Flagler bought tracks, built more, and slowly pushed his line down the East Coast. City by city, swamp by swamp, he carved a path from Jacksonville to Daytona, then to West Palm Beach, and finally to the young city of Miami, which barely existed before his arrival. Miami was a gamble, but Flagler made it work. He built the Royal Palm Hotel on the banks of the Miami River and extended his Florida East Coast Railway all the way there in 1896. In doing so, he transformed the city from a subtropical backwater into a gateway of commerce, luxury, and migration. When the trains came, the people followed. Land prices surged. Towns emerged along the tracks. Agricultural exports, especially winter vegetables and citrus, could now reach northern markets in days rather than weeks. Florida was no longer distant. It was desirable. But Flagler wasn't finished. His most ambitious vision lay farther south still. Key West. An island city closer to Havana than to Tallahassee, it had once been among the richest in America thanks to shipwreck salvage and Cuban tobacco trade. But it was isolated. Flagler wanted to connect it to the mainland with a railway over the sea. Engineers scoffed. Locals called it the folly. Yet Flagler pressed on. Mile by mile, bridge by bridge, the overseas railroad grew across the coral and currents. In 1912, at age 82, Flagler rode triumphantly into Key West aboard his private railcar. The journey had cost lives and fortunes, but to Flagler, it was worth it. He died the following year. His name, by then, was stitched into the fabric of modern Florida. The groundwork Flagler laid created more than infrastructure. It planted the seed of a dream, a Florida not of swamps and storms, but of sunshine, wealth, and endless possibility. In the years that followed, that dream would grow out of control. By the 1920s, Florida had entered a fever. The Great War had ended. Americans were flush with money, driven by a new spirit of optimism and risk. The stock market soared, but in Florida, it was the land that people gambled on. Property became the commodity of the moment. Towns like Coral Gables, Hialeah, and Hollywood, once sand and scrub, became poster children of a modern Eden. Developers painted paradise in brochures, offered installment plans for lots sight unseen, and promised untold returns for those who acted quickly. Speculation drove prices to absurd heights. Empty tracts of land sold multiple times in the same week. Rail cars full of building materials jammed the docks and depots. Miami was the epicenter, a boomtown of stucco mansions, neon lights, and unchecked ambition. Newspapers called it the Magic City, a place growing so fast that locals joked it must rise overnight by spell work. The gold rush wasn't gold, it was real estate. But like every rush, it was unstable. Behind the palm-lined boulevards and champagne parties, pressure built. The infrastructure couldn't keep up. Roads crumbled under the weight of traffic. Railways were clogged. Housing outpaced sanitation. Labor was short. And then the ships stopped coming. In 1925, the freight system collapsed under the sheer volume of building supplies. A rail embargo slowed deliveries to a crawl. Investors grew nervous. Rumors spread. And in 1926, the bubble burst. first psychologically, then financially. The price of land plummeted. Buyers disappeared. Projects stalled. Unfinished buildings stood like ghosts among half-laid roads. And then, nature struck. On September 18, 1926, a Category 4 hurricane roared ashore near Miami. It was the nightmare everyone had ignored. Winds exceeding 125 miles per hour shredded buildings, uprooted trees, and turned debris into missiles. The city drowned in storm surge and shattered under wind. More than 370 people were killed, and tens of thousands left homeless. Damage reached $100 million, a staggering figure at the time. The illusion of invincibility was gone. The sunshine fantasy had been mugged by reality. Miami and the state at large reeled. Relief was slow. Insurance payouts were uneven. The boom had become a bust. Florida tried to recover, but before the scars could fade, another storm arrived. In 1928, a second hurricane swept inland from the Atlantic and slammed into Lake Okeechobee. The storm itself was brutal, but it was the aftermath that stunned the nation. Dikes around the lake failed. Water surged out, flooding low-lying farming communities south of the lake. Entire towns were submerged. The death toll soared past 2,500, most of them black migrant laborers working in the sugar fields. Their names were barely recorded. Mass graves were dug. The story, for many, faded into silence. The dream of Florida was still alive, but it limped now. The developers had fled. The railroads were bankrupt. Towns that had promised fountains and theaters offered only cracked sidewalks and debt. The Great Depression was still around the corner, but Florida had already lived its own economic collapse. In the wake of the storms, the state began to rethink. Building codes were slowly introduced. Drainage districts were created to control flooding. But much of the growth remained unregulated, vulnerable to the same forces that had undone it before. Nature had reminded the newcomers that Florida did not belong to them, not entirely. The hurricanes were not accidents. They were part of the land's memory. Yet even in the ruins, something persisted. The railroads, battered but standing, still connected towns. The beaches still glimmered. The sun still drew visitors, even as the economy sagged. The same things that had attracted Flagler still pulsed beneath the surface: climate, coastline, and a peculiar American hunger for reinvention. The boom had ended, but Florida's story, as always, would begin again. Chapter 8: World War and the Military State. The war arrived without a declaration. It drifted in with the warm breeze off the Atlantic, hidden beneath the surface of the sea. In early 1942, German U-boats patrolled Florida's coast like wolves in the shallows. They sank merchant ships within sight of the beaches. Flaming wrecks lit up the night, and oil slicks rolled onto the sand. Bathers in Miami and Jacksonville watched black smoke curl into the sky where a freighter had once floated. Florida, like the rest of the country, had entered a new era, but its war would begin with fire just off the shore. World War II reshaped Florida more dramatically and permanently than any hurricane, boom, or policy before it. It transformed the peninsula from a backwater of failed land schemes and half-finished dreams into one of the most strategically important locations in the United States. With its long coastline, open skies, and flat terrain, Florida became something the War Department couldn't ignore: a giant open-air training ground. The federal government moved fast. Within months of Pearl Harbor, the state was dotted with airfields, naval stations, amphibious training schools, and boot camps. From the Panhandle to the Keys, the war came in waves of construction, of uniforms, of engines and orders. The sleepy towns that had once welcomed tourists now braced themselves for barracks and barbed wire. Stretches of pine forest were flattened for runways. Swamps were drained to make space for gun ranges. Hotels were converted into hospitals, schools into command centers. Nearly every corner of the state was pulled into the effort. One of the first and largest centers was Camp Blanding, near Stark in north-central Florida. Originally a National Guard training facility, it was rapidly expanded to become a major infantry replacement training center. At its peak, it held more than 60,000 troops at a time. The surrounding area, once rural and quiet, boomed with activity. Shops sprang up. Dances were organized. Train stations overflowed with soldiers on weekend leave. Further south, Miami became a hub for naval aviation. The U.S. Navy established Naval Air Station Miami at what had been the city's municipal airport. Pilots trained to fly bombers and fighters, while thousands of support staff learned the mechanics of modern air warfare. Pensacola, long home to naval aviation, became even more vital, churning out flight instructors and engineers. In the Gulf and the Atlantic, submarines and destroyers patrolled for German threats, while aircraft scoured the waters for periscopes. One of the war's more unusual training centers was established at Fort Pierce, on Florida's eastern coast. There, the U.S. Navy created a top-secret base to train a new kind of warrior, the Naval Combat Demolition Units, the precursors to the Navy SEALs. These men were taught to swim ashore silently, plant explosives on enemy beach defenses, and disappear before the first wave landed. Fort Pierce, quiet and unassuming, became the birthplace of an elite force that would shape modern special operations. The influx of servicemen and federal dollars changed Florida's economy almost overnight. Hotels that had sat vacant since the Depression filled with officers and nurses. Local businesses thrived on military contracts. Entire industries shifted to meet wartime demand. Shipyards in Tampa and Jacksonville expanded, building and repairing vessels for the Navy. Cattle ranches in the interior fed the growing military population. Citrus farms supplied vitamin C to troops overseas. Florida, long dependent on tourism and seasonal agriculture, became part of the wartime supply chain. But war didn't just bring money. It brought people. Young men from New York, Ohio, and Illinois arrived for training and wrote letters home about the warmth, the beaches, and the palm trees. For many of them, it was their first time seeing the South, their first taste of a subtropical climate. Some came, trained, and left. Others stayed, married, or made a note to return after the fighting stopped. Florida was no longer just a destination for the idle wealthy. It had become known to millions of ordinary Americans. The social changes were just as profound. The military bases were melting pots where soldiers from across the country and across racial and cultural backgrounds were thrown together. The rigid norms of the Jim Crow South collided with the broader federal policies of the armed forces, especially when it came to black servicemen. Though the military remained segregated, the sheer scale of mobilization brought black Americans into new roles, as soldiers, mechanics, medics, and factory workers. In Florida, this often sparked tension. White supremacy was still deeply entrenched, and black veterans returning home found themselves navigating a society unwilling to accept their service as equal. Women also entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. With men off at war, Florida's women stepped into jobs they had never held before, welding in shipyards, driving trucks, working in administration, and operating communication equipment. The wartime labor shift was temporary in the eyes of many, but it planted seeds that would grow in the decades to come. Yet for all its importance to the war effort, Florida remained physically vulnerable. The German submarine campaign off its coast continued through 1943, and the state prepared for the possibility of deeper attacks. Blackouts were enforced along the coastline. Residents were warned not to light cigarettes near the beach. Civil defense drills became common. Air raid sirens wailed through the cities. There were rumors, never confirmed, of saboteurs landing in the night. The war felt close, because it was. In the meantime, returning soldiers cycled through Florida's bases before being sent overseas. Many passed through without ever firing a shot in combat, but their presence reshaped the landscape. Temporary barracks became permanent neighborhoods. Military infrastructure became civilian airports. And the memory of Florida, etched into the minds of servicemen who had once come reluctantly, lingered. By the time the war ended in 1945, Florida had hosted over 170 military installations and trained hundreds of thousands of troops. It had sent more than 250,000 of its own men and women into uniform. Nearly 4,000 Floridians would not return. Their names appeared on plaques and headstones from Tallahassee to Key West. But the transformation didn't end with victory. The war had not only defended the country, it had introduced Florida to it. The railroads had brought northern visitors a generation earlier, but World War II brought an entire nation's attention to the peninsula. What had been a strategic necessity became an economic opportunity. Soldiers who had trained on its airfields returned to build lives. Contractors who had worked in its shipyards stayed to expand industry. The war had opened Florida's doors wide, and the world had walked in. The military, too, never fully left. Bases like Eglin, Tyndall, and MacDill remained fixtures of the defense system. The Cold War was already casting its long shadow, and Florida's proximity to the Caribbean, its year-round flying weather, and its vast open spaces kept it central to U.S. military planning. World War II had begun with wrecked ships off Florida's coast and ended with a boom that no enemy could have foreseen. The peninsula had been tested by global conflict and emerged not only intact, but elevated. For the first time, it stood not just as a state, but as a national stage, military, economic, and cultural. The war had changed the world, and it had changed Florida forever. Chapter 9: Civil Rights and Change. The sun still shone, but the shadows were long. Florida, to the outside world, was a postcard of beaches and citrus, highways lined with palms, and towns named for saints and dreams. But beneath the gloss and the glow, something was stirring. In small churches, in courtrooms, on school steps, and behind diner counters, the long-denied demand for dignity was rising. Florida's role in the civil rights movement was not as headline-grabbing as Selma or Birmingham. Yet the struggle was here too, quiet, fierce, and often overlooked. It began, as it so often did, in schools. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The verdict rippled across the South, and Florida was no exception. Officially, state leaders urged compliance, but in practice, resistance was widespread, especially in rural counties where white citizens' councils and school boards worked to delay, dilute, or outright defy integration. Unlike in some Deep South states, Florida's defiance was often wrapped in the language of legality and procedure. Officials didn't stand in schoolhouse doors. They formed committees, rewrote zoning lines, and offered freedom of choice plans that kept schools segregated in all but name. In counties like Hillsborough, Duval, and Escambia, lawsuits had to be filed just to enforce the ruling, and even then, change came slowly. In Miami, however, the battle unfolded differently. The city's black community was older, larger, and more organized than in many other Florida towns. In Liberty City and Overtown, pastors, lawyers, and teachers built a foundation for resistance that combined legal strategy with direct action. By the late 1950s, local chapters of the NAACP were pursuing desegregation, not only in schools, but in public facilities, transportation, and housing. The movement was not without cost. Activists lost jobs, churches were threatened, homes were firebombed, harassment by police was common, and arrests were used as a tool of suppression. In St. Augustine, the oldest city in America, became the site of some of the ugliest violence of the civil rights era. Led by Dr. Robert Haling, a local dentist and civil rights leader, Black residents of St. Augustine began pressing for full integration of public places in the early 1960s. Their calls for justice were met with violent backlash. Klansmen marched openly. Night riders targeted homes. The sheriff's office looked the other way. When Haling and several others were severely beaten in 1963, the message was clear. The old order would not fall without a fight. But the resistance only grew stronger. In 1964, Haling invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to join the movement in St. Augustine. It was a risky move, but a calculated one. National media coverage followed King, and the campaign's organizers knew that if the world could see the brutality, it might force Washington to act. Marches began. Sit-ins were held. Protesters waded into segregated hotel swimming pools, only to have managers pour acid into the water. Arrests surged. Violence escalated. When King himself was jailed in St. Johns County, it made national headlines. The images of beaten demonstrators, jeering mobs, and police complicity shocked Northern audiences. Just weeks later, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But legislation didn't mean transformation. In cities like Tampa, Jacksonville, and Tallahassee, the process of integration was met with subtler forms of resistance: white flight, underfunding, bureaucratic delays. Schools were nominally integrated, but often remained deeply unequal. Many black students were bused long distances, while neighborhood schools remained de facto segregated. White parents formed private academies. The line had shifted, but the divide endured. In the Panhandle, where the cultural ties to Alabama and Georgia were strongest, progress moved even slower. Small towns clung tightly to old hierarchies. Economic intimidation was used as a weapon. Job offers disappeared, credit vanished, and arrests materialized out of nowhere. Yet even in these places, the movement persisted. Sometimes it looked like marches. Other times, it was a teacher quietly refusing to use separate textbooks, or a pastor speaking from the pulpit about justice instead of just heaven. Florida's diversity made its struggle complex. In South Florida, where Cuban exiles, Caribbean immigrants, and northern transplants crowded into Miami and surrounding cities, the fight for civil rights became tangled in questions of language, nationality, and class. Tensions between Black Americans and newly arrived Latino populations sometimes flared, especially over jobs and political attention. Yet these same cities would become the birthplace of new, multi-ethnic coalitions, shaped by shared experiences of exclusion. Out of this crucible came leaders. In 1968, Florida elected its first Black state legislator since Reconstruction, Joe Lang Kershaw, a teacher from Palmetto. His election wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of organizing, registration drives, and door-to-door activism. In the years that followed, others would join him. Gwen Cherry, the first black woman in the state legislature. Arnett Girardot, a dentist who became a powerful state senator. Carrie Meek, who would rise from the Florida House to the halls of Congress. These new voices brought more than symbolism. They fought for tangible change, improvements in housing, health care, education, and labor protections. They challenged gerrymandered districts, corrupt sheriff's departments, and discriminatory ordinances. And they did it from within a system that had, for generations, been designed to exclude them. Still, victories were uneven. In many parts of the state, poverty remained entrenched. Urban renewal displaced black communities under the guise of progress. Highways cut through historic neighborhoods like Overtown and Paramore, destroying homes, churches, and cultural institutions. Policing remained a flashpoint, frequently violent, rarely accountable. But something else was taking shape beneath the surface. Identity. The civil rights movement in Florida wasn't only about breaking down the old, it was about building something new. Institutions like Bethune-Cookman College, Florida A&M University, and other historically black schools became hubs of activism and education. Black newspapers like the Florida Sentinel Bulletin and the Miami Times chronicled the movement from the inside, telling stories that mainstream papers ignored. Churches weren't just spiritual centers. They were logistical headquarters, legal aid clinics, safe havens. And despite every setback, the arc of the movement kept bending. Slowly, unevenly, but forward. By the 1970s, Florida's role in the national civil rights story had changed. No longer simply a battleground, it had become a proving ground. A place where the fight for equality collided with politics, urban development, and shifting demographics. It wasn't a perfect story. It wasn't even a complete one. But it mattered. Because behind every protest was a mother. Behind every march, a teacher. Behind every vote, a life changed. Florida had not been the face of the civil rights movement, but it had been its backbone in many places. Its struggle had been quieter, perhaps, but never less fierce. Chapter 10. Disney, Tourism, and the New Florida. It began in silence. In 1964, land scouts moved quietly through central Florida, buying up parcels of swampland, cow pasture, and pine flatwoods under the names of shell companies. Small farms were sold off for more than they were worth. Speculation grew in whispers. No one knew who was behind it, only that the deals were fast, the money was real, and someone, somewhere, had a plan. The plan was Walt Disney. By the mid-1960s, Disney was already a titan. Disneyland in California had redefined the American amusement park. It was clean, efficient, and immersive, blending fantasy with engineering in a way no one had done before. But Walt was frustrated. The California park was boxed in by the city that had grown up around it. There was no space to experiment, to build the future. He needed land, vast, empty land. And in Florida, he found it. Central Florida then was far from the tourist mecca it would become. Orlando was a modest city, surrounded by lakes, orange groves, and cattle ranches. The heat was oppressive, the mosquitoes relentless. But the state had something Walt Disney needed even more than charm: location. With the construction of new highways and the expansion of air travel, Florida sat within a day's reach of most of the eastern United States. Millions of potential visitors lived within driving or flying distance. In 1965, After acquiring over 27,000 acres, Disney revealed his secret. At a press conference in Orlando, flanked by Florida's governor, he announced plans for the Florida Project. It would be bigger than Disneyland. It would be more than a theme park. It would include hotels, transportation systems, even an experimental prototype community of tomorrow, Epcot, a vision of urban planning and innovation that Walt hoped would shape how people lived. He wasn't just building a park, he was building a world. Walt Disney never saw it completed. He died in December 1966, just weeks after unveiling his plans. But the company he left behind pressed forward. Construction on what would become Walt Disney World began in 1967. It was one of the largest private building projects in American history, a miniature city emerging from marshland, complete with underground tunnels, man-made lakes, and roads engineered to control every detail of the visitor's experience. When it opened in October 1971, the Magic Kingdom was the crown jewel. It was familiar to those who knew Disneyland, Main Street, Cinderella's Castle, Space Mountain, but it was bigger, cleaner, and more ambitious. The project also included 2 hotels, a monorail, and a man-made lake with its own ferry boats. It wasn't just a theme park. It was a destination, and people came by the millions. Disney World changed Florida's identity. Tourism had long been a part of the state's economy. Hot springs in the 19th century, Miami Beach in the 1920s, roadside attractions in the 1950s. But now it had a nucleus, and it was Disney. What had once been a land of alligator wrestlers and orange juice stands became a global center of fantasy. Other parks followed. SeaWorld opened in 1973. Universal Studios would come later. Smaller parks rose and fell, but the gravitational pull of Disney remained. The economic impact was immediate. Tens of thousands of jobs were created, not just in construction and park operations, but in hotels, restaurants, airlines, travel agencies, and advertising. Orlando's population exploded. Suburbs expanded. Infrastructure was modernized. Entire towns grew around the tourism economy, their identities shaped by what vacationers needed and expected. Local politics changed too, often in favor of the tourism lobby, which now had outsized influence over zoning, transportation, and development. But Disney's power didn't stop at economics. In 1967, the Florida legislature granted Disney an unprecedented level of autonomy through the creation of the Reedy Creek Improvement District. Within its borders, Disney could build roads, operate utilities, issue bonds, and essentially govern itself. It was a private empire in all but name, an arrangement that drew little protest at the time, but would be scrutinized more heavily in later years. Still, few could deny the results. Disney was clean, efficient, and prosperous, and Florida, at least economically, was better for it. As Disney grew, so did its vision. Epcot, once imagined as a utopian city, became another theme park, Epcot Center, focused on innovation, culture, and corporate futurism. Later, Disney MGM Studios and Animal Kingdom expanded the resort into a multi-day destination. Entire neighborhoods, like Celebration, were designed and built under the influence of Disney's brand of nostalgic modernism. Florida, once mocked for its chaotic development and cultural shallowness, now had a curated identity, carefully packaged and broadcast to the world. The cultural shift was deeper than most realized. Families from across the globe came to Florida not for history, nature, or authenticity, but for spectacle, escape, and comfort. The Disney model taught them how to navigate the state, through gift shops, parking trams, and character breakfasts. The Florida dream was now filtered through the lens of fantasy. Still, not all of tourism was mouse ears and castles. Other regions of the state capitalized on the boom, reinventing themselves for new audiences. Tampa promoted busch gardens, blending theme park thrills with exotic animals. Daytona leaned into auto racing and spring break revelry. The Keys marketed their bohemian charm. Everglades tours, airboat rides, and alligator farms offered more rustic thrills. The Panhandle, with its white sands and emerald water, quietly built a loyal following of Southern vacationers. Each region found its niche. But Disney set the pace. Every new hotel, attraction, or innovation rippled outward. Tourism became Florida's dominant industry, surpassing agriculture and manufacturing. Seasonal work patterns changed. School calendars adapted to tourist flow. The state's budget, increasingly reliant on sales taxes and tourism revenue, became vulnerable to external shocks. Hurricanes, recessions, global crises. Behind the scenes, the tourism machine was not always magical. Low-wage jobs, often without benefits, supported much of the industry. Housing prices in tourist hubs soared, traffic worsened, environmental concerns multiplied as wetlands were drained, aquifers were tapped, and wildlife corridors gave way to parking lots. But the demand didn't slow. Florida had become a dream engine, fueled by sun and illusion, and it ran year-round. In time, other forces would shape and challenge that engine. But in the decades that followed the opening of Disney World, there was no doubt who had rewritten Florida's story. Not a general or a governor, not a banker or a pirate, but a man with a sketch pad and a kingdom of imagination. Walt Disney didn't just build a theme park. He reshaped an entire state. What had once been a swamp became the stage on which millions would perform their vacations, their honeymoons, their childhood memories. The new Florida had arrived, branded, choreographed, and engineered to delight. It was easy to forget that beneath the castles and fireworks, the land still remembered other stories. But for most visitors, that didn't matter. They had come to Florida for the magic. And now, at last, it was everywhere. Chapter 11. The Political Battleground. For a moment, the world held its breath and stared at Florida. In November of 2000, as Americans went to sleep believing they had elected their next president, something strange began to unfold. The race between George W. Bush and Al Gore was too close to call, hinging on a single state. Florida's electoral votes would decide the presidency, and Florida, true to form, refused to offer a clean answer. The vote margin was razor-thin. Gore had won the popular vote nationally, but Florida's 25 electoral votes would hand Bush the Electoral College if he prevailed there. Initial returns gave the state to Gore, then Bush, then no one. The margin? Just a few hundred votes, out of nearly 6 million cast. Then came the recount. Ballots were scrutinized under fluorescent lights and media glare. Election officials stared through magnifying glasses at tiny paper holes, debating whether a hanging Chad or a dimpled Chad constituted a legitimate vote. In some counties, the punch card voting machines had failed to register choices cleanly. In others, ballot design, most notoriously the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County, led voters to mark the wrong candidate. Elderly citizens, many of whom had lived through multiple wars and elections, now found themselves at the center of a global political drama. The legal battles began immediately. County election boards, state officials, and federal courts wrestled over deadlines, procedures, and standards. Partisans on both sides flooded into Florida, lawyers, strategists, protesters. Cable news channels parked vans outside county courthouses, broadcasting every twist of the increasingly surreal saga. Phrases like machine recount, manual recount, and voter intent became part of everyday conversation. At the center of the storm stood Florida's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, a Republican who certified Bush's lead despite demands for further hand counts. Her decisions were challenged. The Florida Supreme Court weighed in. Then, on December 12th, the United States Supreme Court intervened. In Bush versus Gore, the court ruled that the statewide recount must stop. The decision effectively awarded Florida and the presidency to George W. Bush. The final certified margin, 537 votes. To many, Florida became a punchline, a symbol of democratic dysfunction, a state where old machines, poor ballot design, and bitter partisanship had managed to throw the world's most powerful office into chaos. But underneath the late-night jokes and pundit fatigue, something deeper was at play. Florida's place in American politics had shifted. It wasn't just a big state. It was the state. The political battleground where every vote mattered and where every election carried the potential for national consequence. This didn't come out of nowhere. Florida had long been politically complex. It was the third most populous state, with an electorate that defied easy categorization. The Panhandle leaned hard to the right, military-heavy, evangelical, and Southern in culture. South Florida tilted left, especially in urban centers like Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach. But even here, distinctions mattered. Cuban Americans, many of whom had fled Fidel Castro's regime, trended Republican, particularly older generations. Puerto Ricans in Central Florida leaned Democratic but had lower turnout rates. Retirees from New York and the Midwest brought their own politics, often shaped by unions, pensions, or foreign policy concerns. Florida was not a monolith. It was a mosaic, and it was growing. Each year brought new residents, immigrants, retirees, young professionals, and families seeking lower taxes or better weather. With them came new political calculations. Pollsters struggled to model turnout. Campaigns flooded the state with money, advertisements, and volunteers. Presidential candidates couldn't afford to skip Florida. One misstep in Tampa or Jacksonville could ripple across the electoral map. The state's reputation as a swing state solidified through the 2000s. In 2008, Barack Obama carried Florida, riding a wave of enthusiasm among young voters, Black communities, and Latinos. 4 years later, he held it again, narrowly, despite economic headwinds. In 2016, Donald Trump flipped the state back to the Republican column, winning support from rural voters, Cuban Americans, and older retirees. The margin was wider in 2020, as Florida bucked national trends and handed Trump a comfortable win, even as he lost the presidency overall. Each cycle told a different story, and each time, Florida was front and center. Campaigns learned to speak Floridian. They tailored ads to specific zip codes. Spanish-language radio became a battlefield of narratives and misinformation. Visits to diners in the villages or rallies in Hialeah were broadcast nationally, not for their immediate impact, but because Florida's voters served as a proxy for America's mood. Polling remained volatile. In some years, Florida defied expectations. In others, it delivered exactly the kind of chaos it had become known for. But it wasn't just presidential elections. Florida's political landscape hosted some of the most contentious and closely watched races in the nation. Senate contests drew national funding and attention. Gubernatorial races became testing grounds for national strategies. The 2018 midterms saw both a governor's race and a Senate seat decided by margins of less than half a percentage point, triggering yet another round of recounts. For many Floridians, the sight of ballot boxes, lawyers, and national reporters had become routine. Politics in Florida wasn't just high stakes, it was deeply personal. The issues that shaped its electorate were often rooted in geography. In the Keys and along the coast, climate change and hurricane recovery were central concerns. In Miami, immigration and foreign policy toward Latin America carried emotional weight. In Central Florida, school choice, labor policy, and Puerto Rican statehood all factored into the calculus. In the Panhandle, gun rights, religion, and veteran services dominated discussion. The intensity of Florida's political scene also fostered a distinctive brand of partisanship. Voter suppression and access became recurring flashpoints. Laws governing early voting, voter ID, and felon disenfranchisement were rewritten, challenged, and debated in every cycle. The passage of Amendment 4 in 2018, which restored voting rights to most people with felony convictions, was heralded as a major civil rights victory. But the state's implementation of the law, requiring former felons to pay outstanding fines before registering, sparked further controversy and litigation. Partisan control of the legislature and governorship meant that redistricting battles often broke along party lines, with maps challenged in court over accusations of gerrymandering. The state's political machines were sophisticated, aggressive, and often opaque. Campaign spending soared. Super PACs operated with little oversight. Political operatives became household names, and through it all, the state's image evolved. Florida was no longer just the swing state. It was the unpredictable one. The one with the potential to surprise. The one where an election night could swing wildly by county, by demographic, by margin of error. The punchlines about hanging chads had faded, but the tension remained. Every cycle carried the possibility that Florida would once again determine the direction of the nation. And whether by margin of 537 or 100,000, its vote would echo far beyond its borders. Chapter 12: Climate, Crisis, and Conservation. The water has always defined Florida, shaped its land, its history, its people. It carved the coastline, nourished the orange groves, swallowed entire towns in storms, and gave life to one of the world's rarest ecosystems. But in the 21st century, water began to change. It came too fast, rose too high, and refused to recede. Florida, once built on the promise of sunshine and paradise, now found itself balancing on the edge of a rising tide. Part natural wonder, part cautionary tale. Nowhere was that tension more visible than in the Everglades. Once stretching from Lake Okeechobee all the way to Florida Bay, the Everglades is not a swamp but a slow-moving river of grass, wide, shallow, and alive with a complexity that defies simple description. It is a world of sawgrass, mangrove, cypress, and slough, a place where panthers prowl, manatees drift, and flocks of wading birds rise in sudden clouds. For centuries, it functioned as the central artery of South Florida's ecology, absorbing rain, filtering water, sustaining agriculture, and buffering the coast against storms. And for more than a century, humans have tried to tame it. In the early 1900s, engineers viewed the Everglades not as a marvel, but as an obstacle. They dug canals, built levees, and drained vast sections to create farmland. Cities rose where wetlands once stood. Highways bisected the flow of water. Sugarcane thrived in the muck soil south of the lake. The result was profit, but at a price. The ecosystem began to collapse. Native species declined. Algae blooms poisoned rivers. Fires raged in dried-out marshes. The Everglades shrank by more than half, and what remained was broken, fragmented, starved, and sick. Efforts to undo the damage began in fits and starts. In 2000, the U.S. Congress passed the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, the largest environmental restoration project in American history. Its goals were ambitious: restore natural water flow, improve water quality, revive habitats, and reclaim wetlands. Billions of dollars were pledged. Projects were mapped out: reservoirs, water treatment areas, aquifer recharge systems. But implementation lagged behind vision. Politics, lawsuits, and funding shortfalls slowed the process. Progress was real, but uneven. Some birds returned, some marshes revived, but the Everglades remained in a precarious balance, and the water kept rising. Florida is ground zero for sea level rise. With more than 1,300 miles of coastline and millions of people living within a few feet of sea level, even modest changes in the ocean's height spell dramatic consequences. Miami Beach, in particular, became a symbol of the crisis. Streets flooded not only during storms, but on sunny days, so-called king tide flooding, where seawater gurgled up through storm drains and pooled in neighborhoods. Pumps were installed, streets were raised, but the sea kept coming. Climate models painted a grim picture. By mid-century, vast stretches of coastal Florida could be underwater or uninhabitable due to repeated flooding. Saltwater intrusion threatened drinking water aquifers. Insurance rates skyrocketed. Developers, long the engines of Florida's growth, began to whisper about retreat. The state's geography offered no mercy. Much of South Florida sits atop porous limestone, like a sponge. Seawalls, levees, and barriers that work elsewhere fail here because the water seeps up from below. The very ground beneath the state is vulnerable. This is not just about beachfront mansions or hurricane season. It is about the future viability of entire cities. And yet, development continued. Condominiums rose in flood-prone areas. New subdivisions pushed into wetlands. Mangrove forests, natural defenders against storm surge, were cleared for boat slips and seawalls. The clash between growth and conservation, profit and preservation, never truly resolved. It simply shifted. Local governments wrestled with zoning laws. State leadership often avoided the words climate change entirely. But in the streets of Miami, the back roads of the Panhandle, and the barrier islands of the Gulf, the crisis was not theoretical. It was lived. Florida has always known hurricanes. They are woven into its folklore and its architecture. Towns have been rebuilt, renamed, even relocated after storms. But in recent decades, hurricanes have grown stronger, wetter, and more unpredictable. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew flattened entire neighborhoods south of Miami, causing over $25 billion in damage. It was a wake-up call. Building codes were strengthened, emergency response systems overhauled. But Andrew would not be the last. In 2004 and 2005, a string of hurricanes, Charlie, Francis, Ivan, Jean, Wilma, tore through the state, testing every system and leaving a trail of devastation from coast to coast. And in 2018, Hurricane Michael, a Category 5 storm, slammed into the Panhandle with winds over 160 miles per hour, leveling towns like Mexico Beach and Panama City. In its aftermath, forests were flattened, homes shredded, and survivors left to rebuild in silence. Each storm left more than debris. They left questions about how to build, about where to live, about who would be left behind. In rural counties, recovery was slower, uneven. In low-income communities, often the hardest hit, the aid arrived last or not at all. Hurricanes became not only environmental events, but political ones, revealing the fault lines of class, race, and access. Meanwhile, conservationists fought to preserve what was left. The Florida Wildlife Corridor, a statewide initiative to connect fragmented habitats and allow species to migrate safely, gained traction. Land trusts purchased sensitive areas to prevent development. Activists pushed for bans on offshore drilling, stricter water quality standards, and the restoration of natural fire cycles in forested areas. There were victories. Manatee populations rebounded in some regions. Endangered species were reintroduced into protected zones. Native plant initiatives reshaped public landscaping. But the pressures were constant. Agricultural runoff continued to feed toxic algae blooms, which coated rivers and beaches in green slime and left fish gasping on the shore. Red tide events emptied coastal towns, choked wildlife, and harmed human health. Urban sprawl consumed pine flatwoods, uplands, and scrub habitats. And still, the population grew, over 1,000 new residents arriving every day, each needing water, electricity, and space. In this complex web of beauty and threat, Florida's identity twisted into something paradoxical. It was both Eden and edge. It offered escape but faced erasure. Its economy depended on the very things most at risk: beaches, water, warmth. Tourists came for the sunshine, but stayed in hotels hardened against storm surge. Residents bought homes in subdivisions named for birds that no longer nested there. Science, policy, and tradition clashed at every level. Schoolchildren learned about mangroves and marshes while new highways paved over them. Climate adaptation grants funded studies and pilot programs, while neighboring counties denied the problem existed. Some communities banned the use of the phrase global warming. Others appointed chief resilience officers. Through it all, the land remembered. The Everglades flowed slowly, imperfectly. Storms rose, struck, and passed. The tide inched higher year by year. And beneath the politics and the profits, Florida remained what it had always been: a place of astonishing fragility and power, shaped by water and wind, and now struggling to protect itself from the future it helped reveal. Chapter 13: Culture and Identity. Florida is a shapeshifter. It is pastel and neon, tobacco fields and techno beats. It is church bells in small towns and salsa music in street parades. It has been imagined as a tropical Eden, a southern stronghold, a frontier, a playground, and a refuge, all at once. If Florida has a soul, it is layered, restless, and often contradictory. It is not one culture, but many, stitched together over centuries of migration, invention, and reinvention. Culture here begins with the land and the people who first walked it. Long before European maps drew crooked lines across the peninsula, the Timucua, Calusa, Tequesta, and Appalachia told stories through shell carvings, woven baskets, and ceremonial dances. Much of their legacy was shattered by colonization, but fragments survive, in pottery patterns, in place names, in stories passed down in silence. These early voices echo faintly in the soil, in the ridges of old shell mounds, in the marshes that still breathe under the weight of history. Then came the waves: Spanish missionaries and African slaves, British soldiers and Scottish traders, Seminole warriors and Cuban poets. Each wave brought with it new rhythms, new recipes, new beliefs. Florida became a point of contact and collision. No single cultural current ever dominated. Instead, the state absorbed influence like its own wetlands, slowing it, bending it, letting it settle into the landscape. Nowhere is that layering more vivid than in Miami. Miami pulses with a Latin beat. It is not a city that grew slowly from colonial roots, but one that exploded into being, a child of railroads, hurricanes, and exiles. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution sent tens of thousands fleeing the island, many landing in Miami with little more than memory and defiance. The first wave believed they would return soon. They did not. Instead, they built a city within a city. Little Havana was born not out of nostalgia, but survival. Cuban culture reshaped Miami's identity. Spanish became the city's first language in practice, if not in law. Domino parks and cigar shops sat beside art galleries and political radio stations. The scent of cafecito and pork filled the air. But this was no museum. It was a living, evolving culture. Later waves of immigrants came from Nicaragua, Colombia, Haiti, Venezuela, Argentina, and the Dominican Republic, each adding their own voice to the growing chorus. Miami was no longer just a southern port. It became the capital of the Caribbean diaspora. This cultural fusion extended into music and visual art. The Miami Sound, popularized in the late 1970s and 1980s by artists like Gloria Estefan and the Miami Sound Machine, blended Latin rhythms with pop sensibility. Later, reggaeton and Latin trap artists would rise from Florida clubs and house parties, their beats bouncing from Miami to Madrid to Medellin. In visual art, the Wynwood Walls became an international landmark, showcasing graffiti, street murals, and contemporary Latin American art with unapologetic vibrancy. But step outside the metropolitan gleam and the rhythm changes. North of Orlando, in the heart of the state and into the Panhandle, the cultural tone becomes something else entirely. Here, Florida tilts back toward the deep South. Church steeples rise above tobacco barns, country music echoes from porches, and supper is still served with cornbread. The dialect softens, the pace slows, and the stories passed down tend to be local, rooted in kinship, memory, and land. The Panhandle's cultural identity is deeply shaped by its geography. Isolated from the economic engines of South Florida and the tourist corridors of the coast, it developed its own sense of place. Folk art traditions thrive here. Quilting, wood carving, bluegrass festivals. Old-time fiddlers gather in town squares, and gospel choirs still shake the rafters of rural churches. This is the Florida where county fairs matter, where family cemeteries lie shaded under oaks, and where memory is passed more often by voice than by page. Yet even this corner of the state has not remained untouched. The military bases around Pensacola and Panama City brought outsiders in, service members from across the country who stayed, married, and added their own layers to the local fabric. The University of Florida and Florida State became cultural hubs in their own right, nurturing writers, filmmakers, and musicians whose influence stretched far beyond the state. Literature has long struggled to define Florida. It has been painted as paradise, parody, and purgatory. Carl Hiaasen skewered its corruption and absurdity with biting wit. Zora Neale Hurston captured the rich texture of Black life in Eatonville, blending folklore with anthropological detail. Her Their Eyes Were Watching God, published in 1937, remains one of the most important novels not just of Florida, but of American literature. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, writing from a cracker-style house in Cross Creek, brought to life the scrub forests and hardscrabble families of inland Florida. Her Pulitzer Prize-winning The Yearling captured a world already disappearing in the 1930s. She was not from the state, but she came to belong to it. Like many others, she arrived as a stranger and stayed as a storyteller. In more recent decades, authors like Edna Buchanan chronicled the darker corners of Miami, its crime, its glamour, its contradictions. Meanwhile, writers from immigrant backgrounds began reshaping the state's literary voice, penning novels and memoirs that reflected life across borders and languages, from Calle Ocho to Kissimmee. Art galleries from Sarasota to St. Augustine showcase both local folk art and international contemporary pieces. In the Keys, painters capture the light and color of the tropics in ways no photograph can match. In Tampa, the Gasparilla Festival of the Arts and the Cuban Club honor a heritage that spans both sides of the Gulf. Florida art is not defined by one school or movement. It is too fractured, too diverse, too curious. Food, too, is a language in Florida. Cuban sandwiches in Tampa and Miami spark debates about authenticity. In Apalachicola, oysters pulled fresh from the bay are eaten raw with a splash of hot sauce. In Homestead, mangoes and avocados grow heavy on backyard trees, while Haitian griot and pickles mix with Dominican tostones and Salvadoran pupusas in the same food court. Barbecue varies by county. Citrus flavors everything from marinades to pies. Key lime is not just a dessert, it's an icon. This cultural mosaic is both a strength and a tension. Florida is constantly changing. Migration never stops. Its population is younger in some places, older in others. Generations live beside one another, not always speaking the same language, literal or cultural. The state's rapid growth often displaces the very communities that built its flavor. Gentrification reshapes historic black neighborhoods. Beach towns price out fishermen and artists. Trailer parks are bulldozed for condos. What was unique risks becoming uniform. And yet, the soul resists. It resists in the small things, in a mural painted on a corner store, in a festival for a saint whose name no one outside the town can pronounce, in the way someone still calls their grandmother abuela or mima, depending on the block. Culture here is not a single identity, but a negotiation between old and new, north and south, past and future. Florida's soul is not in its skyline, it's in its stories. In the long tale told by an elder at a fish camp near Lake Okeechobee, in the drumming heard on a Haitian holiday in Little Haiti, in the poetry written in exile, the rap recorded in a makeshift studio in Tallahassee, the blues played under live oaks in Mariana. It is there, always shifting, always alive. What unites it all is the land beneath, the sand, the swamp, the city streets. Florida holds these contradictions not as failures, but as facts. It doesn't offer one story. It offers thousands. And in that, perhaps, lies the truest definition of culture. Chapter 14. Florida Today. Florida is never still. Even when the air is thick and the heat wraps itself around the streets, something is always in motion. People arrive, people leave, houses go up, trees come down, languages blend, landscapes shift. It is a state in permanent transition, defined not by what it once was, but by what it is constantly becoming. In the early 21st century, Florida crossed a threshold. It was no longer just the retirement haven or the tropical escape. It became the third most populous state in the nation, overtaking New York. Its growth was not confined to one region, nor driven by one group. Florida's population surged because it attracted everyone. Young workers from the Midwest, retirees from the Northeast, immigrants from Latin America and the Caribbean, and families priced out of other states. There was space, at least in theory. There were jobs, at least for some. There was opportunity if one could navigate the contradictions. Those contradictions ran deep. Florida's demographic map looked less like a single picture and more like a series of mosaics. In Miami-Dade, Spanish was spoken more often than English, and the Cuban exile story shaped generations of politics and identity. In Central Florida, the Puerto Rican community expanded rapidly, especially after Hurricane Maria pushed thousands of families from the island to places like Orlando and Kissimmee. Tampa's Ybor City, once the cigar capital of the world, now told stories of Cuban, Italian, and Black heritage through museums and murals. In West Palm Beach, Haitian Creole rang out in churches and grocery stores. Jacksonville, long considered a Southern stronghold, saw a rise in African American civic leadership alongside growing immigrant populations from West Africa and Central America. These communities did not merely coexist, they reshaped the places they entered. Strip malls turned into culinary tapestries, Jamaican bakeries next to Colombian arepas, Vietnamese noodle shops beside Dominican barbershops. Festivals, parades, and worship services reflected an evolving cultural rhythm that made Florida not only diverse, but layered. It wasn't a melting pot. It was more like a patchwork, stitched from threads that retained their color. Alongside cultural shifts came economic change. For decades, Florida's economy had rested on three pillars: agriculture, construction, and tourism. Citrus groves once symbolized the state's bounty, oceans of orange trees rolling across central Florida. But by the 2000s, disease, hurricanes, and global trade had cut production dramatically. Citrus greening, a bacterial disease spread by insects, devastated crops. Groves shrank, were sold, or were converted into subdivisions. Where workers once picked fruit, developers poured foundations. Construction boomed in cycles, tied to national and international capital. Skyscrapers climbed in Miami and Tampa. Suburban sprawl stretched from Fort Myers to Orlando. Gated communities appeared overnight, but the busts came just as quickly. The 2008 financial crisis hit Florida hard. Entire neighborhoods were foreclosed before they were finished. Unemployment surged. Roads led to nowhere. It was a reminder that the state's economy, like its geography, was fragile. Tourism remained a giant. Walt Disney World, Universal Studios, and hundreds of other attractions turned Central Florida into the country's top tourist destination. Beaches pulled millions to the coast. Cruise ships sailed from Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Port Canaveral, making Florida a global port. Yet tourism, while lucrative, was also precarious. Hurricanes could close hotels, pandemics could ground flights, and most tourism jobs were low-wage, service-based, and dependent on the ebb and flow of visitors. When the world paused, so did Florida's heartbeat. At the same time, something new was stirring. Technology firms opened satellite offices in Miami. Fintech companies experimented with moving headquarters to Tampa or St. Petersburg. Orlando's simulation industry, tied to both entertainment and defense, became a quiet powerhouse. Healthcare expanded rapidly, especially in regions with aging populations. Universities invested in research. Space returned to the headlines. The Cape, once the silent home of a fading shuttle program, roared back to life with private launches and reusable rockets. SpaceX, Blue Origin, and NASA all pointed toward the sky, and Florida with them. Yet for every surge, there was a shadow. Housing affordability became a crisis. As home prices rose, wages did not keep pace. Teachers, nurses, and firefighters struggled to live in the cities they served. Renters were squeezed. Evictions climbed. Trailer parks were sold and razed. Luxury condos sprouted in their place. Gentrification spread from Miami's Wynwood to Orlando's Paramore and Tampa's West Riverfront. For many, the Florida dream felt like something they could no longer afford to chase. Climate also pressed closer, not only as a future threat, but as a daily reality. Flood maps were redrawn, insurance rates soared, salt water crept into freshwater wells, sea turtles nested under artificial light. Storms grew stronger, less predictable. Recovery efforts stretched thin. Each year, the state braced for a season that could undo a decade. Politics, too, reflected the state's tension. For years, Florida had been considered the ultimate swing state. Fought over by both parties, its voters courted with surgical precision. But patterns were shifting. Turnout surged in both directions. Cuban and Venezuelan voters leaned more conservative, swayed by rhetoric on socialism and foreign policy. Younger Latinos, African Americans, and transplants from blue states tilted left. Suburbs flipped, then flipped back. The state's politics didn't move in a single direction. It oscillated, unpredictable, and closely watched. Florida was not just purple, it was fractured. School boards became battlegrounds over curriculum, language, and identity. Local races drew national media. Protests over gun rights, race, public health, and free speech played out in front of Capitol buildings and school gates. The state's laws shaped national debates, and its governors, past and present, carried outsized influence on the country's political stage. And yet, for all the noise, life went on. Children rode bikes under banyan trees, grandmothers shopped at open-air markets, street musicians played violins outside cafes, immigrants took their citizenship oaths in courthouses, and farmers prayed for rain. Families drove hours to see manatees surface in the springs, or to feel the sand beneath their feet on a long weekend. Despite the storms, the heat, the headlines, something in Florida kept calling. Part of that was myth, part of it was hope, and part of it was real. A sense that whatever its contradictions, Florida remained open to reinvention. That even in chaos, it offered the possibility of starting over. It had always been that way. From runaway slaves building new lives in the Everglades, to Cuban exiles rebuilding theirs in Little Havana, to northern workers turning orange groves into suburbs. Florida was a place where the future always seemed just a few miles farther down the highway. But it was also a state of memory. It remembered hurricanes and migrations, land booms and busts, alligator trails and train tracks. It held them in its buildings, its rivers, its faces. Modern Florida could not be pinned to a single identity. It was both coastline and cow country, rainforest and retirement community, Silicon dreams and Spanish prayers. It was too diverse to summarize, too dynamic to freeze in time. And that, perhaps, is what defined it most. Florida was not a finished story. It never had been. It was and remains a state of contrasts.